Islanders run in panic, screaming and waving their arms in terror as the ground trembles and chasms open up in the earth to swallow them. But they do not fear the tremors. They fear what they might unleash. In the deepest, darkest part of the island, a crack tears a hole into a seemingly innocent pile of boulders. In the darkness on the other side, 1,000 hungry eyes open. It had been 10 years since the residents of Araniram Island sealed Choo Choo Charles and his babies away in their rocky prison. The cave-in triggered by the town mechanic had successfully trapped the monstrous train spider and his hatchlings in the caverns, and for the first time in a long time, peace had settled over the island. Over the decades since Choo Choo Charles's imprisonment, the islanders had rebuilt the damage done to their community. Tourism to the island had increased, boosting the economy. Things were actually looking good for once, and like they'd stay that way for a very long time. But nothing lasts forever, and there are more threats in the world than train spiders. Early one morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, the residents of Araniram Island were abruptly awakened by the sound of their homes beginning to rattle. Framed paintings crashed down from the walls, shelves toppled over, books fell off shelves. The ground all over the island was shaking, knocking people down and terrifying the local animals. Earthquake! They all screamed, rushing to seek safety under door frames and tables. There hadn't been an earthquake on the island in 100 years, and no one was prepared to deal with it. One woman, a local school teacher and amateur Choo Choo Charles researcher, was assessing the damage to her home when she had a troubling thought. If the earthquake had caused this much destruction in town, perhaps it had shifted some of the rubble blocking the entrance to Choo Choo Charles's prison. What if the monster now had enough wiggle room to break free? The ground had mercifully gone still, and the earthquake seemed to have subsided. She decided to head over to the tunnel and check things out before any aftershocks hit. On the way to the tunnel, the school teacher stopped by the local librarian's house. After what happened to the previous librarian meeting their death at the jaws of Choo Choo Charles, this librarian had stocked up on weapons and dedicated her free time to combat training. If the earthquake had indeed caused Choo Choo Charles to break free, she'd be the best person to help take him on. The librarian had only just avoided being crushed by her collection of books and antique swords, and was more than happy to come along with the school teacher and get to the bottom of things. She grabbed each of them a weapon, a machete for herself and a shotgun for the school teacher. Then the two left to investigate. The librarian and the school teacher arrived to find the entrance to the tunnel was still blocked by the wreckage of the cave-in a decade ago. The two women were just about to breathe a sigh of relief when the earth beneath them began to shake again. An aftershock, or maybe it was even a second quake. But then the school teacher noticed something. The rumbling sound was louder the closer they got to the tunnel. Before the school teacher could finish her thought, the librarian pointed to a crack that had opened into the rubble door of Choo Choo Charles's prison. The librarian clutched the handle of her machete tighter, worried about what this could mean. Choo Choo Charles have escaped? No, he's far too big. And after 10 years, his terrible brood would be too big too. Maybe we got lucky. Even if the earthquake seems severe, it doesn't seem like it's given Choo Choo Charles a lucky prison break. But the school teacher still seemed unnerved. She knew something the librarian didn't. Araniram Island wasn't built on any tectonic fault lines. This wasn't an earthquake just affecting the cave. It was coming from the cave. And inside the cave, something truly monstrous was brewing. Despite the cave acting as a stone prison for Choo Choo Charles and his horrific babies for a decade, 10 years is plenty of time to plot and plan and scheme. Thousands of claws were digging at the ground as the baby train monsters, now grown into even larger and more dangerous adolescent train monsters, burrowed. Over the years, they built an extensive network of tunnels, like an ant farm beneath the unwitting citizens of Araniram Island. They were like a bomb waiting to go off. The original Choo Choo Charles himself was sitting further back in the cave, his face twisted into a malicious grin, evil and hungry. Contrary to what the librarian believed, Choo Choo Charles's long-awaited prison break was about to take place. Back outside, the rumbling got worse. The school teacher and the librarian could barely stand straight in the face of the terrible tremors. Suddenly, all around them, mounds started to rise out of the earth, like molehills, but bigger. It's time. The Choo Choo Charles offspring, covered in filth, started crawling out of the piles of mud all around them like the living dead. The hungry beasts immediately spotted the two terrified humans standing among them and crawled in to begin feasting. The librarian swung her machete defensively, trying to hold off the teeming hordes of train beasts. The school teacher, a Choo Choo Charles expert, but hardly an expert in combat, started blasting her shotgun at whatever creature was closest. She only had a handful of cartridges, but every second, more Choo Choo Charles babies were crawling out of the ground, infesting the land around the cave like a plague. This seemed bad enough, but things were about to get a whole lot worse. The terrible rumbling only became more powerful, rising by the second as the rocks in the cave mouth vibrated and trembled. Then boom! The rocks exploded out of place, flying through the air and powdering the area with brick dust. A dark chasm was left in place of the blocked-up cave move, and almost immediately, out stepped the monstrous creature that all of Aranirum Island had learned to fear. Choo Choo Charles himself came crawling out, staring at the school teacher and the librarian with his many terrible eyes. And after 10 years in that awful stone prison, he was extremely hungry. But Charles and his children weren't the only monsters on this island to be conducting a prison break. While most of the humans on the island were terrified of Charles and hated him to his core, a few exceptions sat rotting in the town jail. These were Warren Charles III and the Mob, a gang of lunatics who worshipped Choo Choo Charles. The quake that Charles and his subterranean children had caused had shattered the prison walls, releasing Warren and his minions. They began to chant together in worship of the locomotive monsters across the island and prepared to do their favorite thing, capturing innocent people and feeding them to Charles and his minions. There would be no better way to gain favor. Once Charles and his babies had finished devouring the school teacher and the librarian, they traveled further straight toward the town in the center of the island. They would find plenty of food there. While the people were still recovering from the terror of the earthquake, they heard some terrible skittering in the distance, an impossible number of arachnid legs. They looked up and saw the tide of hungry spider train monsters headed by the legendary Choo Choo Charles coming straight toward them. The 10 years of peace had turned into a new era of violence and terror as the tide of monsters washed into the town and began devouring any humans they could get their claws and teeth on. The islanders needed to fight back, or they'd lose control of the situation completely. Some of the islanders were able to grab weapons such as basic firearms or clubs and tried to fight off the trains, but already there were too many of them. It was like they were coming from every angle, almost impossible to fend off. But the train monsters weren't the only things they had to worry about. By this point, Warren Charles III and the Mob had reached the town, and they were breaking into people's homes. They grabbed terrified islanders from their hiding places and dragged them outside before throwing them into the crowds of hungry spider monsters. Watching their victims get savagely eaten by the monsters they worshipped and revered, all Warren and the Mob could do was laugh hysterically. "All glory to Choo Choo Charles and his blessed offspring. We are his loyal servants. May they feed on these worthless humans for the rest of time." Even as some of their own members were devoured by the baby train spiders who had no way of differentiating between worshippers and food, they continued their mission, attacking and dragging away any innocent humans they could find. Things were just getting worse and worse. Bullets whizzed through the air, some finding their targets and wounding the monstrous train creatures. But even if some of the monsters were wounded, there were always so many more. And when even the bravest and most courageous of the townspeople saw the original Choo Choo Charles crawling into the center of town, devouring anything and anyone in his path, they lost hope and fled. What else could they do? The church on the edge of town seemed like the most sensible option. Men, women, and children ran toward the ancient sanctuary, hearts pounding in their chests, hearing that same awful skittering sound right behind them. The train spiders were hot on their heels, followed by the chanting and screeching of the members of the Mob. The innocent sealed themselves away within the church and slammed the giant, heavy doors behind them, all huddling together in what might have been their dying moments. Choo Choo Charles was at the front of the crowd. He wanted to devour every single human inside. When he reached the door, he began battering against it with his head like a living battering ram. It seemed like all might be lost for the embattled citizens of Aranirum Island, as all who remained were now gathered in the church. And outside, Choo Choo Charles and his ravenous babies, Warren Charles III and the Mob closed in, hungry for blood. But a highly unexpected ally was about to arrive. Little did the islanders know, scientists on a nearby research ship had detected huge seismic shifts around Aranirum Island. The scientists, shocked and surprised by these findings, had alerted the nearest mainland county about the potential need for emergency earthquake relief. The nearest vessel fit for a potential rescue just so happened to be a passing Navy battleship, staffed by heavily armed naval staffmen. When the ship docked near the Aranirum shoreline, speedboats were dispatched to the island to provide aid. When the Navy boys reached the island, they discovered the horrifying truth that the island was now infested with horrible monsters, and the sane humans had barricaded themselves inside the church. Sailors immediately poured in, wielding rifles and in some cases even flamethrowers. For once, Aranirum Island had the numbers to fight back. The firepower of the Navy helped frighten the creatures, and even Charles himself back into the cave they had been imprisoned within. The townsfolk left the church, and helped the sailors in the barricading efforts, trapping the monsters once again and recapturing Warren Charles III and his crazed followers. Everyone involved in the incident was sworn to secrecy afterwards, writing it off as a mere earthquake. After all, who would possibly believe them? But deep in the cave, Choo Choo Charles and his offspring knew they could only keep them in there for so long. Charles would escape and feed again, because Choo Choo Charles is the one train that never runs late.